Thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers very much indeed for giving me the privilege and the pleasure to participate in the symposium and to share with you some thoughts on how complementary feeding choices might influence the risk of later obesity. We've known for more than a century that complementary feeds must be provided from the end of the first half year of life onwards, because exclusive milk feeding alone does not suffice anymore. Now, if you talk about complementary feeds, it's important to define what we mean by this term, because there is different definitions. The World Health Organization, in an attempt to promote and protect breastfeeding, has defined complementary feeds as everything given to the baby other than human milk, so including both solid and liquid foods and baby formula. However, pediatricians and pediatric organizations like ESPGHAN find this not very helpful in the communication with parents, and they define complementary foods as energy providing solids and liquids other than human milk and milk formula. So I will stick to this pediatric definition in my presentation. Why is the complementary feeding period so important? We know this is a period between about 6 and 24 months that is characterized by continued rapid growth and development with very high nutrient needs. And we know from many studies around the world that this is the age window where most undernutrition worldwide develops, stunting and wasting occurs, particularly here in this period of 6 to 24 months. It begins there and then, of course, continues thereafter. And so it is very important to provide adequate complementary feeding to close the gap of energy supply that otherwise might arise between the amount of energy provided from breastfeeding and the energy needs for growth. And in addition to energy supply, of course, complementary feedings are very important to provide nutrients, in particular micronutrients like iron and zinc. So why would we think that complementary feeding could affect later obesity risk? Obviously, as I said just now, this is a period of rapid growth and great developmental plasticity, where there's a very high need of nutrients per kilogram body weight. It's a period of transition from exclusive milk feeding towards diverse family foods with major dietary changes and considerable physiological consequences of that transition. It's a period also where taste preferences are imprinted and eating behaviors are learned and imprinted that may affect later feeding choices. And obviously, there's a very large influence of parental behaviors and beliefs, of traditions and regional food habits that affect complementary feeding. If we feed too much, we've seen over many studies in recent years that overfeeding and rapid weight gain in the first 2 years of life increase the risk for obesity later. As shown in this compilation of studies showing the obesity risk of children that had a rapid weight gain the first 2 years of life, and you can see overall, adjusting for other influencing factor, the later obesity risk is almost doubled in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood if you have a rapid weight gain early on. The same is shown in this large study with about 50,000 children followed prospectively. If you have a rapid weight gain and BMI gain in early life, you have a much higher risk of a high body mass index in adolescence, and along with that, an increased risk of obesity. So overfeeding is a problem. We know that with a higher energy intake in infancy, here at 4 months, there's a higher likelihood of rapid weight gain and thereby increased obesity risk later. So if energy from solids are needed to close that energy gap shown to you before, would introducing solids increase the total energy intake? We've looked at this in more than 1,000 infants, in this case formula-fed infants, in the European Childhood Obesity Project trial, where we have detailed dietary records in the first year of life. And you see, compared to those children who have not received solids, those that receive solids, here between 4 and 6 months, for example, have about 50 to 100 kilocalories more energy intake. So yes, solids increase energy intake, but the effect size is not very, very huge. So would that then relate to the risk of obesity, to higher weight gain? Well, it doesn't really. This is the relationship between the time of introduction of complementary feeding and the standard deviation score of weight for age up to the age of 2 years. And yes, there is a slight difference between the different timings of introduction, but there's no consistent relationship between timing introduction and weight gain. So why is that? Because timing of introduction is also related to energy needs of the baby. Introduction of solids increases energy intakes, but we see that those children who had a higher energy requirement prior to complementary food introduction also have an earlier introduction. So there is an interaction between the two factors. And this was also confirmed in these two systematic reviews, showing that the age of solids introduction is not associated overall to the risk of overweight and obesity. But that's good news. We can be relaxed about when to introduce complementary feeding and can listen to the signals of the baby. And as you know, within Europe, we advise that complementary feeding should be introduced between the beginning of the 5th and the 7th month in populations with a high risk of infections because they have unsafe water supply, unsafe food supply. We advise that complementary foods should only be introduced at the beginning of the 7th month. So what about the type of complementary feeding that we provide? Well, as I alluded to before, if we provide a high amount of energy, then that increases early weight gain and later a higher body mass index. But also a higher supply of protein, particularly of milk protein, in the first year of age predicts increased body mass index and also body fat later, as shown in this meta-analysis. So it relates to what we call the early protein hypothesis, which we've also demonstrated for milk feeding. If we provide too much protein, more protein than the baby needs, then we enhance weight gain and later obesity many years later. So we don't want to give too much protein in infancy. And one important element here is to limit cow's milk as a drink if feasible and affordable, because cow's milk provides 3 times as much protein as human milk or modern formula. And therefore, in the German Society of Pediatrics, we advise not to provide any cow's milk as a drink in the first year of life to infants, and in toddlers to limit regular cow's milk to no more than 2 cups per day or 200 to 400 milliliters per day. Now, is it protein alone or is it other nutrients as well? This is a study from the Netherlands that has looked at lowest and highest quartiles of intakes in relation, and that is in infancy, in the first year of life, in relation to the percentage of overweight at school age at 8 years. And you see, yes, again, there's an effect of protein. Higher protein has an increased risk of later obesity, but also sugar has a risk. With high protein and high sugar intake, there's the highest risk of obesity. So sugar is also a critical nutrient, particularly sugar from beverages. And of course, with complementary feeding, we increase the carbohydrate intake. You can see it here. During the period of pure milk feeding, the carbohydrate is about 45% of the energy. And then with complementary feeding, it increases to 55% of the energy. Now, if there's a lot of sugar in that complementary feeding, that may be a risk factor for health. If you look at what children get across Europe, again in the CHOP study, you see there's a difference between formula-fed and breastfed babies. The formula-fed babies get complementary feeding earlier, and they have a higher consumption of commercial complementary foods. And of these, there's a significant proportion of sugared commercial complementary foods to a higher extent, particularly early on, than in the children who were breastfed. So that is of concern. If sugar increases the risk of late obesity, if you have too much sugared complementary feeding offered in our shops for commercial baby foods. We looked at what these children had, and most of the commercial baby foods are cereals. And if you look at the composition of the baby cereals, then the majority of these are sugar. Sweetened, refined cereals are the majority of the grains that were consumed in these more than 1,000 children in 5 countries across Europe. We also looked at what is on the market offered in Germany. And again, if you look at the cereals you see here in pink, these sweetened cereals, and if you look, for example, at the milk porridges, the majority of these are sweetened, and these are very popular products. Grain porridges are less much sweetened, and breakfast cereals also less. But the milk-based cereals are sweetened to a large extent. And if you look at what it is not only sugar that is added, but it's also sweetened by fruit juice concentrated and other products. And these don't have to be added, don't have to be declared as added sugar. So you can have on the market products that have 40%, 40, and more sugar, and they have on the label written no sugar added, because the sugar is coming, for example, from concentrated fruit juice. And the parents believe this is not a sugared product, and it is extremely sweet. Of concern, many of these products also do not contain the critical micronutrients that we think complementary feeding must provide. Only less than 30% contained iron, which is very critical in the complementary feeding, 40% only zinc, and 28% iodine. So it's important to advise parents to choose less sweet products that are rich in micronutrients, that are good sources, particularly of iron and zinc and iodine, preferably as well. Another type of products that we are very concerned about and that are having increased popularity on the markets are these sweet foods, purity sweet foods from squeezable pouches that often have this tip on it with a cap that you can unscrew. And families like it because it's so convenient. They can put it into the mouth of the baby and let it suck directly from the pouch. Now, from a pediatric standpoint of view, this is a true disaster. If you look at the composition of these on the German market, they have often a very high energy density and extremely high sugar contents. Up to 90% of the energy of these products are coming from sugar of the products that are on the market in Germany. And of course, if we provide a product that is so high in sugar and that's continuously sucked out of the pouch, then this regular consumption bears the risk not only of an imbalanced nutrient provision with too much sugar and too little critical nutrients, but also of dental caries and of overweight. So the German Society of Pediatrics has issued a warning against the use of these products. It has said that infants and young children should experience a variety of foods and food textures, not only pureed foods, including pieces, to learn normal eating behavior, should be supported by responsive feeding. It should not be left to the baby to suck from the pouch by itself. Infant and young children should not suck pureed or liquid complementary foods from baby foods, but this should be offered from a spoon or should be fed as finger foods. And the German Society of Pediatrics has discouraged infant feeding from these food pouches. So lastly, let's go to taste. Studies like this one from Andrea Meyer have shown that variety of tastes actually increases the later acceptance of new foods. So that's a very important issue. And in line with that, the Alsbach study in a large number of children, more than almost 8,000 children, has shown that more home-cooked vegetables at the age of 6 months, a high intake of home-cooked vegetables in high variety, was associated with an increased consumption of vegetables eaten at 7 years. Now that's important in relation to obesity because we know that higher intakes of vegetables protect you against obesity. It reduces the risk of obesity. So accustoming children to taste preferences that promote healthy eating is important. Give them a lot of different vegetables in infancy, limit sugar and sweet taste, do not add salt in order to imprint food preferences that are associated with less obesity risk later. Finally, we should remember that complementary foods are not only providing nutrients. Complementary feeding is an opportunity for learning, for interaction between parents and infants. So we should advise parents to focus on the baby when they provide foods, not look at the phone, switch off the radio and television, promote responsive feeding, observe these signals of the infants, and keep talking to the baby. It's a unique opportunity for learning on both sides. So in summary, the timing of complementary food introduction is of little impact on later obesity risk. We should promote providing a variety of vegetables and tastes, not adding sugar or salt to the complementary feeds. We should avoid overfeeding and avoid high intakes of milk protein, sugar, and sweet beverages. We should advise families to choose preferentially commercial complementary foods with less sugar and more micronutrients. And we should warn them not to use these commercial products from squeezable pouches. Complementary feeding is an opportunity for communication interaction and for learning desirable eating behaviors and to promote responsive feeding. We should inform particularly families at risk, and in our studies we find that families with formula-fed children more commonly follow unfavorable nutritional behaviors. So in our counseling, we should perhaps put particular attention to families of formula-fed children and advise them how to improve complementary feeding. If you have more questions, you could go to early-nutrition.org, which is a barrier-free, cost-free e-learning portal for pediatricians and other healthcare professionals. And there we have a core module on complementary feeding where you can learn everything you wanted on complementary feeding. Again, it's free of charge. It provides you with European CME points, and it is very popular. We have more than 12,000 course participants now from all over the world, so it cannot be bad. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention.